Hey everyone, welcome to another video. Today we're going to be talking about the 2022 gubernatorial races in the United States and what some of these races are looking at. We covered these about 10 or 11 days ago, and a lot has changed since then in certain states. And I've also researched in other states like Minnesota, where the race is a lot closer than people may expect. And we're going to talk about that today and talk about what these factors are going to look like going into these midterm elections for the gubernatorial races. Obviously, we've seen Glenn Youngkin perform very well in Virginia in 2021 during that gubernatorial race, but we do have to take into account that Roe versus Wade had not been overturned at that point. Phil Murphy was very close to losing re-election in the state of New Jersey to Jack Ciattarelli. Ultimately won that race, but it was much closer than many people predicted it would be, including myself. I thought that Phil Murphy would have easily won that race, considering New Jersey is a Democratic 15-plus state. And I even thought that Terry McAuliffe might have a chance in Virginia going into Election Day, but I ultimately did predict that Glenn Youngkin would win. And we're going to look at some of these races, and I want to keep in mind that this is the end of July. This will be my last prediction for the Senate. For the governorships. I'm sorry about that. In the month of July, the next time I do a video, it will be August, and the next time I do a Senate video also will be August. So I do want to point that out, and we have a lot of things that are going to go into effect when talking about these races. So let's go ahead and start talking about some of these safe Republican seats that ultimately no one's really, hang on, I need to change Kansas. No one's really that worried about for the Republicans, for the GOP. Many people predict that it will be Republican wins. And ultimately, we'll go ahead and do the same thing for Democrats. And ultimately, Massachusetts is a state that currently has a Democratic governor. And Maryland did have its primary. The Trump-endorsed candidate did win. And ultimately, I don't even think that there's a chance for the GOP to win Maryland again. But these are some of the states that I think that that we can look at going into these midterms. For the most part, overall, these are the states that we're going to be looking at. And we're also going to look at Minnesota, a state that in years prior we haven't really looked at, just because it's a state that, yes, is a toss-up state, but ultimately Democrats are normally the ones that win that state, right? And we've got a lot of races that we can talk about today, and ultimately I can't talk about all of them for obvious reasons, but one race I do want to talk about is the state of Oregon. And we're going to go ahead and go over there where the incumbent, I believe, Katie Brown, is not running for re-election, can't run for re-election, whatever that may be. But ultimately, this is a lean Democratic race in all pollsters' predictions here. But the thing that's interesting is that we're seeing this independent candidate doing traditionally more well than prior years past, and it's ultimately really making the Republicans at a good advantage in these races. Ultimately, I still think that the Democrats will still win this race, but it's something to look at going into it. And if we go to 538, they have this as a lean Democratic seat as well, and they have 69% chance of winning for the Democratic candidate, Tina. So, that's something to point out, but ultimately it's definitely probably going to be a Democratic win in many pollsters' predictions, and even just, basing it off of what we've seen in prior years. But ultimately, at this time last year, we never thought that Glenn Youngkin would win. So, it's something to keep an eye on for sure. But I'm going to go ahead and characterize that as a Democratic state. The next state we're going to look at is the state of Nevada. And this state is one in which I also think is going to be very important. I apologize if I say his name wrong, but Steve Scalise, I believe is how you say it, Steve Solok, I'm not sure, but he is up for re-election in the state of Nevada, and ultimately has not been doing as well as people may have thought he would, and ultimately, this is a toss-up race, and it's a tilt Democratic for one inside elections polls, but ultimately he has been leading in recent polls. Joe Lombardo has been trailing him, but he did lead in a Republican pollster at the beginning of June. So ultimately, still looks like a Democratic win, but it is a lot closer than people may have thought. But some people may have predicted that it would be a close race. I'm going to go ahead and characterize it for the Democrats. We're going to save Arizona for last because it's one of those states that we have gotten a lot more updates on the state since we last had a video. So the next state we're going to talk about is the state of Kansas. The state of Kansas is one in which Laura Kelly is the incumbent, and I believe she is seeking re-election. And ultimately, a lot of these have this as a lean Republican, but a lot also have it as a toss-up. As we see, her opponent is leading in recent polls, but she did lead in a Democratic pollster last September. But ultimately, a lot's happened since that poll was done. And ultimately, I believe that the Republicans will win this state. It's just in the environment that we're in, the Republicans have a better chance at winning. The next state we're going to talk about is the state of Texas. Texas is one in which a lot of people think that the Democrats may have some sort of chance. Ultimately, I still think Greg Abbott will win. But looking at looking at polls and things of the sort, it's really important to just keep an eye on this race. I mean, all of these polling sources have it as lean, likely, or solid Republican race, and I would agree for the most part. But if we look at recent polls, Beto O'Rourke has been doing better and better as we speak. I don't think there has been any updated polls since we last talked about this race, but ultimately, Greg Abbott is still doing traditionally well in the state of Texas, and we look at FiveThirtyEight, which has this as a 96% chance for Greg Abbott winning. And ultimately, I agree. I think Greg Abbott will win, but I think it'll be closer than many people may have originally suspected going into the race. The next race we're going to talk about is the state of Georgia. Georgia is one in which Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp are facing off yet again. And this race in the most recent poll, Survey USA, has been very competitive. Stacey Abrams only 1 point behind Brian Kemp, but we've seen in prior polls, one from July 14th through the 22nd, that Brian Kemp was up 48 to 43 and 52 to 45. Ultimately, Brian Kemp has been leading in polls, and I think that will continue. And FiveThirtyEight also has this as a solid Republican, likely Republican for Brian Kemp, 86% chance of winning. I agree. I think Brian Kemp will perform well in Georgia, and I think he ultimately will win. The next state we're going to look at is Florida. Solid Republican for Ron DeSantis, Charlie Crist at 5%, Ron DeSantis at 95%. And if we look at recent polls in the Florida gubernatorial race, Charlie Crist has been leading, and I believe I talked a little bit about this in the last video. He was leading by 2 points, but this was a poll that was done at the end of May into the beginning of June, and ultimately that's been almost 2 months ago. So it actually has been 2 months ago. Today's July 27th. So this race in general, we don't know exactly what those poll numbers are looking like right now, but Ron DeSantis is popular in the state of Florida, and I believe he'll easily pretty much win re-election. The next state we're going to talk about is the state of Ohio, and I don't think I actually pulled up information on this race, which is fine, but I do believe, I'll go ahead and pull it up really quick, but I do believe that Mike DeWine will win this race, and ultimately, we can look at polls and we can look at things like that. Ultimately, many pollsters predict this will be a likely or safe Republican race, and ultimately, polls have suggested the same exact thing. Mike DeWine, 45% chance of winning. The Democratic opponent, 30% chance of winning, and that was a poll done at the end of May. Ultimately, like I said earlier, there has been a lot that has changed since the end of May, but something to keep an eye on. Ohio, I do believe, though, will go to the Republicans. The next state we're going to talk about is the state of Minnesota. Let me make sure I can pull this up really quick. Yeah, so I have this pulled up for one reason and one reason only. The Republican, Scott Jensen, is doing better in the state of Minnesota. We see that he's only trailing to Tim Walz by 2 percentage points. And if we scroll up, Tim Walz is the incumbent and is seeking re-election. And ultimately, this race is a lot closer than people may have expected. While I still believe the Democrats will win it, it's something to keep an eye on. And FiveThirtyEight has this as a likely Democratic race, 85% chance of winning for Tim Walz. But polls suggest that this will be a closer race, and I think it's something that going into the midterm elections in November to keep an eye on. The next state we're going to talk about is the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin is a state in which Tony Evers won his first election back in 2018 for the governor's mansion and ultimately is seeking re-election now. And the former lieutenant governor of the state of Wisconsin is running against him. Ultimately has been trailing in polls, and 538 even rates this as a lean Democratic race, 67% chance of winning for Tony Evers. But I do believe it's going to be closer than many people expect. There's many reasons that I believe that, but ultimately, I mean, the obvious is here. I mean, we've seen in some polls where, you know, it was tied, but ultimately recent polls have suggested that this race is going to go to Tony Evers, and I believe that that will happen, but I think it's something to keep an eye on going into the midterm elections. The next state we're going to talk about is the state of Michigan, and I completely discredited the state of Michigan in my last video, a big mistake on my part, but ultimately one that we should look at. Fox News and RCP are the only two sources that rate this as a toss-up race. All others lean, tilt, or likely Democratic race, including 538. Gretchen Whitmer is doing pretty well in the state of Michigan, and it's for obvious reasons. If you know anything about politics, you would know every Republican candidate that has taken the lead has had something happen, and ultimately, until now, we haven't had a clear front runner for the nomination for the Republicans, and the primary hasn't happened just yet. But Gretchen Whitmer is doing very well in the state of Michigan, and I think that will continue. Every opponent that she's facing in these Republican polls, the Republican and Democrat polls, she is winning against, and I think there's no exception to that. Likely Democratic for Gretchen Whitmer, 94% chance of winning from 538's opinion, and I believe that will continue. I think Gretchen Whitmer will win the state of Michigan. The next state we're going to talk about is the state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro and Doug Mastriano are facing off. Doug Mastriano is a Trump-endorsed candidate who looks into the election fraud theories and things like that, and ultimately is not doing very well to Josh Shapiro, where Josh Shapiro has 51% chance, or not 51% chance of winning, but 51% in the most recent poll done July 19th through the 21st, and Doug Mastriano only at a 39%. If we look at this on 538 as well, this rates this race as a likely Democratic. Josh Shapiro 80% chance of winning to Doug Mastriano's 20%. Ultimately, I do believe that this race might close out a little closer as we get closer to November, but right now, if I was to have to guess, I would say that the Democrats will win it and Pennsylvania will go blue. This puts the Democrats at 23 to 26 governor mansions for the Republicans. So, you know, something that I want to point out before we start talking about Arizona is Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania are all states in which we see this blue wall being built back, at least in the governorships. While we can't fully talk about the Senate races, because for obvious reasons we're not talking about Senate races today, but ultimately, if we look at this, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania are three states in which should be close in these midterm cycles, but ultimately aren't as close as many people predicted them. Michigan and Pennsylvania, almost safe Republicans in some pollsters' predictions, likely Democratic at least, in some pollsters' predictions. I'm sorry if I said Republican, but Wisconsin is one that's a little bit closer. But ultimately, these races should be easy pickups for the GOP going into these midterm cycles, given the fact that they are in a red type of environment. But we're going to go ahead and start talking about the state of Arizona. And the state of Arizona is one in which Kari Lake is likely to win the nomination, but if we look at 538, this has Katie Hobbs at a 51% chance of winning, Kari Lake at 49%. This is a hard race to predict. Kari Lake is the candidate that's looked to win the primary come next Tuesday. But let me look for just a second at these primary races. Katie Hobbs is leading in the primary for the Democrats, but the Republicans is much closer. Kari Lake and Karen Robson are tied in the most recent poll. And this was done from July 22nd through the 24th. I do believe Kari Lake will win the primary, but ultimately, at that point when we start looking, what does the Katie Hobbs versus Kari Lake, what does this look like going into November? Ultimately, I still think Kari Lake will pull it off with the red type environment that we are in. But I do think Katie Hobbs definitely has more of a chance of winning than she ever has. Kari Lake, though, is doing well in the state of Arizona, and it's just recently that this race has tightened up, and Katie Hobbs took a majority in the race. But ultimately, this is my map at the end of July for the gubernatorial races in 2022. I really appreciate you all for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe this to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It would mean a lot. Make sure to ring the bell for more notifications. We're working on a Discord server to get that set up so that you all can talk about midterm elections, 2024 predictions, and others very, very soon when we get all of that set up. But that's going to be in the future. In the meantime, go follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. We have updated videos, political analysis, posts, things like that over there. I would love for you all to go follow them. They're linked down in the description down below. Make sure to go watch some other videos, and I appreciate you all again for watching. Thank you all so much, and I will see you in the next video.